Our first panelist for this second panel session on divestments, licensing, and policy directives is Edith Onwuchekwa, Director, Legal and Company Secretary at Seplat Energy. Please a round of applause for her as she comes forward. Edith Onwuchekwa. Our next panelist is Olushino Sipasi, partner at ALX. A round of applause for him as he comes forward. Please keep clapping until he gets to the stage. Thank you so much. Let's appreciate our panelists. Thank you, thank you, thank you. All right. Our next panelist is the General Counsel at Tetra Core Energy Group. Please welcome Okezie Oka Avai. A round of applause for him as he comes forward. And our final panelist is no other than the Senior Legal Attorney at Owando PLC, Nelson Onuoha. A round of applause for him as he comes forward. All right. To moderate this esteemed panel, I have the honor of welcoming Okechukwu Okoro. A round of applause for him as he comes forward. And so, like I said earlier, licensing, divestments, and policy directives, legal risk and opportunity in Nigeria's evolving energy market. It is a timely conversation because as the market shifts, those who understand the law will not just manage risk, they will define opportunity. And so please join me in welcoming to the microphone for her presentation, the scene setter at Olaniwu Ajayi, Mrs. Folashade Oluyade. A round of applause for her as she comes forward.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for this privilege to be here. As she has rightly said, I'm representing Dr. Tomini Olabi, who unavoidably is absent this afternoon. So I'm just going to be speaking what he has told me to say on setting the scene for this distinguished panel. Licensing, divestment, and policy directives, legal risk and opportunities in Nigeria's evolving energy market. You know, when I got this, the first thing I said was, energy is oil and gas and power. I was introduced as an oil and gas lawyer, so I'll be speaking more about the oil and gas sector in setting this scene. And so, the Nigeria's oil and gas market is obviously at an inflection point. The confluence of licensing activity, ongoing divestment, and a new wave of policy directives, which we can see with all the directives and policies that we are having from the government. You know, it's sort of reshaping the commercial landscape, the legal architecture that underpins the sector. So, at this point, the choices that the government, the regulators, IOCs, indigenous players, financiers, and of course communities, the choices they make will define not only deal-making in the short term, but the sector's competitiveness and credibility for years to come. What is the market today? The market in context. We have the Petroleum Industry Act, which was passed a couple of years ago, which recognizes the institutional framework, which reorganized the institutional framework and fiscal regime, creating a clearer split between midstream, downstream regulators and the upstream regulators on the other hand. We have a corporatized national oil company now, and we have a statutory platform for host community development, and of course there are a host of other, reforms and initiatives brought about by the PIA. Since the passing of that PIA, there has been implementation which has gathered pace. You have licensing rounds which have opened access to, you know, acreages that have been sort of abandoned, or even new acreages that are just coming up. Regulators have been busy issuing guidelines upon guidelines, trying to give life, to provisions of the PIA to give more direction to the players in the sector. And the executive has signaled, a nice policy tilt towards, gas, decarbonization and investment facilitation. But in all of this, the IOCs continue to divest. We keep seeing divestments of their onshore assets, citing reasons such as, they are rebalancing their portfolio, moving more to cleaner energy sources and all that. And, but whilst you have IOCs divestments, the indigenous players are taking up these opportunities and, of course, scaling up in their activities in the sector. I think I was reading somewhere that at least over 50% now of acreages are now being operated or controlled by indigenous companies, and this is obviously a fallout of the recent divestments that we've experienced in the sector. All of this is unfolding, and amid global energy transition pressures, capital discipline, and heightened stakeholder expectations on transparency, climate, and community impact. Licensing. What are we seeing on licensing? A sustainable licensing regime will rest on predictability, obviously. And for investors, there are legal questions that will be asked around, how predictable is the licensing regime? If I want to get a license, how am I supposed to go about it? How clear is the legal framework around licensing? These are some of the questions, that you begin to see. I'm going to rush because I don't have much time. And unfortunately, I couldn't connect to internet, so I'm having to use the paper, but it's fine. But there are opportunities in this licensing. I just spoke about, new players coming up, coming into the sector and taking up the assets and just basically running with it. So licensing is being deployed to attract, capital, to attract local content participation and quite a number of other initiatives in the sector. And of course, licensing can also can be a lever for policy objectives, issues of flaring elimination. As you can see, we now have companies being licensed, to conduct activities that basically are aimed towards, reducing flaring of gas and all of those. Divestments, I've spoken about that already. There are asset exits that we're seeing today, and acquisitions are basically these asset exits and acquisitions are shaping, the operatorship in the Niger Delta and even beyond. On the buyer side, you are having indigenous operators that are facing a financing environment that places a premium on cash flow predictability, robust offtake arrangements, FS mix mitigation, and prudent hedging. These are things that the buyers will face to make your project sort of bankable. But opportunity is clear in the divestment, right? Divestment has broadened participation, it has deepened local capacity, and we are unlocking stranded, assets or stranded value. There are policy directives as well, and I won't go too much into that. Policy directives which are basically aimed at providing clarity, promoting transparency, and just bringing to life what exactly the impact of the PIA should be. But from a legal risk perspective, the key is coherence and continuity, because these directives, as they are being passed, they have to align with the PIA, which I spoke about as when I was talking about what is the market today. The PIA is the market today, right? And of course, direct regulations, guidelines all around the PIA. So these directives, how much are they aligning with the PIA? Before I go to the panel, right, there are some questions that I will just sort of invite us to begin to consider and think about as we look at this topic together. How can Nigerians' licensing rounds best translate into investments that reach FID, Financial Investment Decision? What specific contractual and regulatory features make the difference between interest and commitment? It's one thing to have an interest, and it's another thing to be committed to developing that interest after it is acquired. In divestment, what structures are most effectively balance seller exit certainty with buyer sustainability and community confidence? And how should decommissioning and environmental liabilities be funded to satisfy both regulators and lenders? These are questions that we're still about to answer or trying to answer. On policy, which incentives and directives are most catalytic for gas and midstream investment? How can stability be credibly signaled without undermining legitimate regulatory evolution? Finally, how do we integrate methane reduction, flare out, and host community governance into the core economics of projects so that compliance and competitiveness reinforce each other than compete? These are the questions around the topic that we're going to be discussing today. Nigeria's oil and gas market is evolving towards greater transparency and broader participation. The legal community's role is to convert policy. That's what I think, so this is just my view. The legal community's role is to convert policy ambition into bankable certainty. Because at the end of the day, if you have projects that are not bankable, I mean, at the end of the day, how do we eventually, unlock the value that we're talking about in the sector? To shape transactions that are fair, resilient, and financeable, and to ensure that the sector's growth is inseparable from environmental integrity and community prosperity. I'm now going to be handing over to our panel, who are going to unpack the risks, the opportunities, and most importantly, the practical ways to executing all these issues. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Fola. Thank you very much, Fola, for setting the scene. As the MC did mention, the conversation this afternoon around licensing, divestments, and policy directives is one that can be summarized by saying we have opportunities with lots of supposed uncertainties. And Fola has picked a number of the issues arising from this. Concerns around policy, licensing, the risk. We're going to look into this. And I would like to start first, still with Fola. You've mentioned and highlighted a number of key addressed issues around legal risk and opportunities with this evolving energy market. And the question, I know you had actually addressed this in the course of your course of your presentation. And the question would be, what's legal policy or change would you see has made the most significant impact on the Nigerian energy market in recent times, and in what ways in particular?
Okay, this is working. Okay, thank you for that. Okay, Chuku. And as you rightly said, I think I've sort of spoken to what I think, or what I believe is the most significant or policy or factor that is sort of shaping the industry today. That, for me, is the passage of the PIA, right? The Petroleum Industry Act was passed, I think, 2021. And since then, we've had quite a lot of new things, should I say, happening in the sector. And I'll speak to just a few, because it's a whole lot of, things that we're experiencing today. Policies, regulations, things that are shaping the sector, right? So how has the PIA changed things? Started by, we now have 2 regulators. We used to have 1 before. You have the NUPRC, you have the NMPDRA. That alone in itself has created, quite a number of issues. But, we won't go into that. So we have 2 regulators now. You have a corporatized NMPC. NMPC was initially a corporation, now it's a Kama company. That comes with quite a lot. The obligations to now have the host communities trust fund, that was never a statutory provision before. The decommissioning and abandonment fund is another initiative that the PIA has introduced in the sector. All these things are issues of obligations and practical matters that operators face in the market on a daily basis, right? You have the establishment of the midstream and downstream gas infrastructure fund. You have provisions around if you're an operator and you are operating in different sectors of the of the oil and gas sector, i.e., upstream, midstream, downstream. You need to put your activities in different vehicles. I've been fortunate to be advising a number of clients trying to navigate the regulatory framework around how exactly are we supposed to do this, right? And which regulator am I interfacing with, for doing this and that, because operators are having to comply with these provisions, right? And the question would then be, how clear are the provisions of the law in even guiding, these operators in doing, in implementing the provision of the law? There are also now provisions around security, obtaining consent, for security, if you are taking security interest, in an asset, in an OML, for example, or PML, as the case may be. That was not in the law before. So I'm just, I'm just trying to remember some of the new things that, should I say, have shaped the industry post-PIA. And for me, these are the things that, it's even because of the PIA provisions, right, that we are having all sorts of regulations coming out from the regulators. And we're also having policy directives, to sort of clarify some of the provisions of the PIA that were not clear. A very good example is the provision on integrated operations. And when that began to cause, some uncertainty or lack of clarity in the market, there were directives issued by the executive to clear or to clarify, what the law was trying to say. But I mean, these are just a few things. So I don't know if I can just stop here, but I think that the PIA is really
a game changer.
It's a game changer.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much for that. So the PIA is the game changer. And the next question will go to Nelson. With the PIA, I would like us to start first. She has highlighted a number of items, things, that has changed under the new regime. So let's start with licensing. For a new entrant into the market, that's the first port of call. Now, there's been, even with the PIA, there are still issues around regulatory uncertainties. Investors still talking about uncertainties in terms of regulatory framework. Now, what's your view about this? You working in-house, right? What's your view about the whole concern around regulatory uncertainty? Do you think these are just perception problems or these are actual problems existing with the PIA?
Thank you very much. I would think it's a bit of both, right? But I would say it's majorly a perception problem. I do not think, and I think it would be difficult to argue, given the myriad of laws we have existing in the industry, that there is indeed a legal uncertainty problem. Mr. just spoke about, the passing of the PIA, right? You also had, in the past 4 years, the passing of the Electricity Act as well in 2023. These are watershed legislations that have sort of introduced significant legal reforms and produced, remarkable results in terms of, how people perceive legal risk in the sector, right? You also have, even from these newly passed laws, regulations, policy directives, guidelines that have been issued to sort of provide further laws, provide further legal basis, right, for investors and business people to understand or have an idea of what the legal risk is in, getting into the industry. For instance, the NUPRC has, since the inception of the PIA in 2021, passed over 20 regulations, gazetted over 20 regulations, right? And you also have the NMDPRA doing that too, all of which are, very available to be looked at on their various websites, right? And you also have the guidelines that have been issued as well. You have the NERC, the Nigeria Electricity Regulatory Commission, issuing guidelines pursuant to the Electricity Act to implement it. So I don't think it's very much concern around legal uncertainty. And in fact, these laws or these reforms have shown, remarkable testaments in the industry. I'll start from something as easy as even the investment that's coming since. The PIA was passed in 2021. You have, NUPRC the other day quoting around 40 billion USD new investments since 2021 as a result of the PIA. You also have, new rigs in country from 4 or 6 back as 2021 to around 69 in country. And even in the area of even in the area of oil theft, which has been a very big issue for the industry. You also have new regulations that have tried to curb it, the upstream petroleum measurement regulations, advanced cargo regulations, that have helped to sort of reduce, that risk. I mean, and since 2021 till today, there has been a 90% decrease, in crude oil loss due to theft. It was around 2,000 barrels per day, and it's now 9,000 barrels per day. So you can see that there's clearly a nexus between, these new laws and the progress we've made in the industry over the years. But, I mean, it's not Uhuru yet. There's still concerns, particularly from an implementation point of view, right? I mean, legal implementation is a concern everywhere. But bringing it home to Nigeria, you see that still provisions, even lovely reforms that have been introduced by the PIA that are yet to be implemented. I mean, I'll give an example. The new provisions on deemed approvals if the regulator does not get back to you on your application for consents, maybe for assignment of your lease or license within a certain period of time. It is deemed that you've gotten that approval, but I stand corrected. I'm yet to see how, that has been implemented in paper, going forward. And I also think it's also about not just the lack of implementation, but also the need for optimal implementation, right? You must implement laws and regulations in the context of your local challenges, right? You cannot apply laws willy-nilly. You need to ensure that, they solve problems. You need to ensure that, that they are purposeful in the application to meet the objectives, right? So you have implementation that has to be, timely, it has to be progressive, it has to be purposeful, it has to be constructive, right? And beyond implementation is also the need to clarify some of the loopholes in the laws. I mean, Ms. Folashade spoke to that overlap between, regulatory overlap between the NUPRC on the upstream and the NMDPRA on the midstream and downstream. There's been directives that try to, cure that, but it would be best if, we have laws, FEMA laws that sort of put a pen to, how we can clarify those overlaps and give investors greater certainty as to, which regulator to deal with and what regulatory risks they are supposed to look into. And there's also even the application of the PIA as well. You have the Section 303 saying that it don't apply to pre-existing leaseholders, holders of oil mining leases and prospecting mining leases until they've converted into PIA terms until, their leases are due for renewals. But you still have provisions in the same PIA that are drafted in such a way that they are of immediate application, right? So it gives regulators a bit of uncertainty as to how they can dimension their legal risks of these provisions. And thankfully, as we all know, that the PIA is, there's a bill undergoing the House seeking to amend the PIA, and we hope that these concerns will be addressed in those provisions at the time.
Thank you very much, Nelson. Thank you. Very helpful. The next question will be to Shino. Nelson has basically highlighted a number of, is a change. The PIA is the game changer, yes. A lot of things has changed, the good side of it, issues around oil theft, clarity on a number of things, separating upstream, midstream, and all the rest of them. He has also identified some issues or some challenge. To him, it's not really a question of uncertainty. We know what it is. It's just a matter of enforcement and all the rest. Are there other issues which you still feel? Other things or some other things you think can be done to make these provisions, the licensing provision, the regulatory regime under the PIA, much more efficient, much more transparent, much more predictable? Along the lines of some of the challenges that Nelson has raised.
Well, let me echo the same sentiment that the PIA is really a progressive law, considering where we're coming from. It's basically, it has laid out the entire industry, has tried to segment different activities into different and distinct licenses, has tried to basically decouple activities, vertically integrated activities that are being undertaken, let's say, by one entity, requiring that such activities should be separated, even if they are associated companies, right? Even if they are affiliates, at least into different, those activities should be done by different companies, distinct persons, and also had created a robust licensing framework. So the PIA is a progressive law in that respect. I must also mention that as much as possible, the PIA has tried to reduce the use of discretion when it comes to granting approvals. As much as possible, it has tried to reduce the issue of discretion. And let me just speak a bit about that, and I think that is where we need to work on. So as much as, no matter how good a piece of legislation is, the operation of that legislation is important. It is one thing for legislation to confer regulatory autonomy on the regulators. It is another thing for the regulators to seize hold of that regulatory autonomy and ensure that that regulatory autonomy is translated into concrete reality in the marketplace. Because the translation of that autonomy into concrete reality in the marketplace helps the confidence of the market, helps market participants, licensees, to be sure that if I meet criteria A, B, C, D, E, F, this will be the result. To be able to fairly and accurately predict that in this circumstance and in that circumstance, this is going to be what the regulator will do, will say. This will be the type of decision that I will be expecting from the regulator. I will say that PIA had laid the groundwork for that. But I think the issue is how well are the regulators taking hold and implementing this regulatory authority without doing the typical thing of wanting to sound out the political establishment, the minister, as to what decision should be taken in this respect and what decision should be taken in that respect. So when I'm talking about predictability, it is not as though when you look at the PIA, the framework for predictability is not there, but when it comes to the operation, the feedback we get from clients or from people who interact with the regulator is basically questions about this regulatory independence, right? And sometimes it may be that the failure to exercise that independence is constraining the ability of the regulator to take decisions and make decisions on time. So that's an issue that the regulators still have to work on. Seizing that regulatory independence, not yielding the space where regulators have to take certain decisions, not yielding that space to political actors, not yielding the space to ministers. And I'm saying this not just not just with respect to the oil sector, but also with respect to the electricity sector. Now, the Electricity Act and the PIA is not the first law in the natural resources sector that has tried to enshrine regulatory independence. And I think the first time that was done was in the Mining Act, where the mining regulator was really given a lot of latitude, and I remember the industry was quite excited and expecting things, to move quickly and smoothly. But unfortunately, they lost the momentum or the the regulators under the Mining Act lost the momentum when they yielded control unnecessarily to the minister. When they yielded control unnecessarily to the ministers, and then things began to happen. Licenses that had been issued, I think in one fall swoop, thousands of licenses were cancelled or were put under some form of suspension, and it sent that entire industry into a tailspin.
Panic.
You understand? And when you look at all of these, that issue around predictability is necessary. And when there are confusion, when I say confusion, sorry, when there's lack of clarity, and now that we have multiple regulators, especially in the oil and gas sector, there's a need really for those regulators to pull together and see how they can help, how they can work collaboratively and send a unified signal, to the market, so that people are not left confused. Should I seek for, let's say, refining license, a processing license from regulator A or from regulator B? Or people getting confused as to what is the weight of presidential directive as against the provisions that you have in the PIA? Or what is the weight of guidelines issued by one regulator saying that one thing should be done as against the weight, statutory provision that you have in the PIA. So clarity, predictability, and predictability in terms of process, predictability in terms of timing, that actions are taken, and then entrenching trust in the market that regulators will do what it has been set up to do without any form of political influence. I guess those are issues to be looked at, and those are things to be done to ensure that serious confidence is built in the investing community.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. Sino. Thanks very much. Predictability, clarity as to process and the timing. I know that, Nelson, you did talk about the issue of deemed consent. We wait to see how that plays out. Maybe someone will tell us later how that has worked. Whether we've had situations where parties have been able to proceed on the basis of deemed consent and all the rest of them. Now, another area I would like us to look at, and the question would start with, I would like to start with you, Nelson, still, this time around, is on the other leg or arm of our discussion today is on divestments, right? We've witnessed a lot of divestment taking place recently. A lot of the IOCs are stepping aside, especially their onshore assets, and we are seeing local indigenous companies step in. And of course, this raises a lot of opportunities and risk. Now, the question will be from a legal standpoint, what are some of these opportunities? What are some of these, the risk you see arising from this recent divestment of energy assets?
Yeah, thank you very much. I think, there's been clearly a wave of divestments within the sector, in the past 3-4 years, particularly IOC to indigenous divestments, where you have independents and indigenous oil companies taking over assets that were originally handled by Nigerian affiliates of international oil companies. When you speak to risks, I would say, chief among them is, of course, the contractual risks, right? You're stepping into the shoes of someone who has been in an asset, most of them for years, decades. You're taking over the liabilities or contractual liabilities, that were associated with the divestors' performance in the assets or stay in the assets. You're having to aggregate them. Sometimes these risks are even hidden because you're not even able to measure as much, despite as much due diligence you do. You're not able to itemize or identify all these risks, embedded in some of these contracts you're having to novate and, come into. It's also, of course, the labor risk, where it has involved the share sale. You're acquiring a company, you're also acquiring the employees of that company. You need to ensure that, in lots of ways, you're protecting yourself from any litigation, employment litigation that may come up, labor claims that may come up, the labor unions, Pegasus, and the rest. And there's also, of course, the environmental risks, environmental remediation risks. You have the D&A, decommission and abandonment risks, where assets that are already in maturation, that have been developed and explored for years, who have, of course, incurred a number of environmental liabilities, and you're taking that on as a new player in the assets. It's one area of risk that you need to ensure you dimension properly, to ensure that you are able to take on, that risk. But in terms of reward, I mean, just like every business venture would have risks, there's also an angle of reward. You're taking on, or you're gaining new assets, right? You're increasing production, you're increasing your reserves, you have new receivables, tied to the asset that you're taking on, right? I mean, for instance, when we acquired the OML 6063 from AGIP, we increased our reserves by about 90%. So there's that strong upside for you. There's also, the angle of innovation, right? Because you're taking over from someone who has been in an asset usually for donkey years, right? You're coming in, you're bringing in new perspectives, you're bringing in new optimal ways of operation, you're bringing in new philosophies. You're able to see, some of those things that may have blindsided, the previous operator, and you're able to bring them to bear to ensure increased productivity. And you're also increasing your market share as well, because you're coming in, taking up new assets, and putting yourself as a veritable player in the industry, both within Nigeria and outside. So I think these are the few risks and rewards that are there. But it's important that, of course, you dimension this risk and ensure that the rewards match the risks, and ensure that you set up your legal structures, your deal structures in such a way that you are properly protected, and enamored against this risk.
Thank you very much, Nelson. And I will take on the next question, still arising from these, the opportunities and the risk. With the recent divestment, we've seen issues around host community issues, decommissioning and abandonment, and environmental issues arising. In terms of the divestment and how this is being managed between the sellers and the buyers. Now, the question would be, how do you think this can be better managed? Because we've seen it more like as an issue in a number of the divestments happening lately, where issues of community, decommissioning and abandonment keep coming up, both in terms of the negotiation among the parties and even in terms of getting approval from the regulator, in terms of giving their sanction. How do you think this can be better managed? Because it keeps coming up with some of with the divestments in recent times.
Okay, yeah, so issues around decommissioning, decommissioning issues, environmental issues, community management issues stay essentially with the license. So anybody who is holding the license will be responsible for it, even if the person is a new entrant. Is a new, the seller is new, right? Sorry, the buyer is new. And we know that the best way to handle it is at the SPA stage, when parties are negotiating. And we know for a fact that a lot of energy is poured into this with respect to determining what the true value of the asset is. Because when you are looking at the true value of the asset, you also need to consider the liabilities that the asset has, the legacy liabilities that the asset has. And I know for a fact that all of these are typically thoroughly discussed. And the best way to really deal with it are the contractual solutions, right, that the parties have devised, that is amongst the parties. Because really, when the buyer comes into the asset, those liabilities really become the liabilities of the seller. But I guess some of the things that have tend to happen is in respect of when the SPA has been concluded. And then parties are going through the typical consent process. And then there are things coming up, sometimes the regulators may come up and say, can you do this? Can you deal with this matter? Can you deal with some of these environmental claims? Can you ensure that this is done before we consent? Before we consent or before we give a final consent, before you can go ahead and let this new buyer come into the asset. I will say that I think those are legitimate regulatory actions, right? Because the legacy holder who has been in the asset, who has been operating the asset for upwards of 50 years, right, is living. I know that for some of those divestments, the local communities were worried because they thought certain outstanding liabilities we have no way of getting properly redressed and properly. So sometimes some of those regulatory intervention that wants to ensure that certain actions are taken or get certain guarantees that certain things will be done, right? I think those are to be expected, and in any climb that will happen. But what should parties do? What should parties do? And this is where we need to go back into the contract. I think every SPA must anticipate that even if we have agreed on a particular structure or on a particular method for handling legacy liabilities, it is possible that the regulator may want certain additional things, right, to be done. And I think it is something that the SPA, when designing an SPA, the SPA has to anticipate that yes, although this is what we have agreed, the regulator may decide that some of these things we have agreed with respect to legacy liabilities that those things need redesigning. And I think a robust SPA should anticipate that so that parties can still come back, look at what some of this action or how some of this action can impact the prices, and if there's any adjustment to be made in the final price that is going to be paid for the asset, that should be done. But absolutely, that responsibility will be the responsibility of the new buyer, and hedging against those responsibilities are things that are best done contractually. The important thing is that the contract should be robust enough to anticipate that there may be variation to what has been agreed as a result of regulatory intervention. And we know that when we're looking at regulatory intervention, it's not just looking purely at business. Regulatory intervention is looking at policy, it's looking at the general well-being of everybody, of both the investors, the host communities, and also the entire country. But I think one of the good things that we can see from that we can gather from the divestment is that one has happened, the second one has happened, the third one has happened to indigenous company. A pattern is being created. The first one may be difficult. The second one will be less difficult. A precedent is being created. A body of system is being created. And when you are creating systems, novel systems like it, there are going to be hiccups. The good thing is that those hiccups are being cleared, and the next one will be better because we can tell that things are going to be done this way and things are going to be done that way. So it's not much of a problem. It's more of a developmental process.
It's evolving.
So it's like PIA in practice,
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you. Our time is fast spent, and if you have questions, you can put down your question. And I have a question for you, Fola. The question now is, on this divestment, a lot of locals are stepping in. Do you think that the framework we'll have today actually supports these indigenous people? You foresee some problems that they are going to face, I mean, with the framework we have currently in place?
I think that question has been answered by the previous speaker, by Mr. Chikwasi. But, okay, so I think that there are the upsides and the downsides, right? So the upside in the sense that, we have this regulatory framework, we have this PIA that seems to be a consolidated, or should I say a streamlined regulatory framework. Some laws were repealed. We now have a law that seems to cover the field. I'm not saying it covers everything, but at least seems to cover the field to a large extent. I've spoken about some provisions that were not in the old PA that have now been given sort of statutory backing. And so there's some sort of clarity around acquisition of assets. Now there's a more, should I say, clearer process to acquisition of assets, at least based on the law. Timelines, somebody talked about deemed consent. I think it was Okechukwu that talked about it. Trust me, that deemed consent thing, I'm yet to see it. I know we write it in SPA sometimes, and we just say, if you don't get the consent, you'll be deemed. But on the day we reanalyze it in the office, and we're like, this is deemed from a buyer's perspective. We wait to see. But then, but at least for me, it was a step in the right direction, however you look at it, because, before, people will wait for months, you are not even hearing anything, you don't even know. And, for every day, time is going, timelines have been delayed, the lenders are waiting, so many things are tied to these acquisitions, right, that is just beyond, waiting for the consent, right? So the deemed consent seemed to be something that was progressive, but is yet to be tested, at least from my own little experience. And of course, you have, I think Mr. Chikwasi was the one that mentioned, the reduction in discretion, and so there are so many provisions of the PIA now that seems to reduce the discretion of the minister, a more transparent bidding, process for acquisition of new acreages and all that. So I would say that, the framework is there and it seems to have its upsides. However, there are still, there's still room for clarity, for more clarity, for improvement, for certainty, for predictability. And I think I'll just give a few examples. So, we were talking earlier on about, some provisions around integrated operations. And, the law explains what integrated operations is, right? But in implementing that provision, the operators that are facing, that are doing these things, that are facing the market, that are actually trying to then now implement, or, to implement provisions of the law, are now having to engage two regulators who don't seem to even have I think you use the word unified, view about the provisions of the law. That caused a lot of, should I say, unrest, in the sector, in the market. And eventually there was a directive that came out that tried to settle it. How far that has settled it, at least based on my own experience again, it's really doubtful. I know that the PIA is being amended, or is going to be, or there are moves to amend the PIA. And then I know that one of the provisions that they're trying to amend is around that. But then I'm still not seeing, that resolution. And I think these things, they might seem very simple, but then they actually have very significant implications on project execution for operators. So there's still that. Mr. Chikwasi again was talking about, when you are trying to seek regulatory consent, and the regulator is telling you to go and resolve some litigation, before you can get consent, even though parties have sort of agreed amongst themselves. I know, the view is that, the SPA should contemplate it. Correct, the SPA should contemplate it. However, maybe also the law can be clearer as to, yes, the liability sits with the licensees, right? But maybe the law can also be clearer that, in a transfer scenario, so long as it is clear that the acquirer is taking it clearly, then that should not be, a condition to the regulator, granting his consent, because that just unduly delays the transaction, and just gives parties a lot of headache in, completing deals, as the case may be. I mean, we've seen...
Maybe I may have to cut you here because of our
okay,
time. Thank you very much, because our time is fast spent.
Thank you.
I'll just give each and every one of us just 30 seconds. And first to be Mr. Shino. What are the opportunities for lawyers?
Oh, well...
30 seconds.
Okay. It hasn't started. Okay. Well, the PIA is still new. There are so many unexplored sections. And I think one of the things we can do as lawyers is to basically do the necessary advocacy to let the industry see the different possibilities that the law offers, both in terms of enhancing business operation, in terms of enhancing processes, and in terms of building an industry that will be world class. I think the law had been made. It's made for lawyers to explain it, and while we wait for the court to interpret it.
Okay, Nelson, what do you think? Just one word.
I would say there's always, to the extent that there's always legal uncertainty, no matter how much you try to issue new laws. The laws cannot always contemplate certain things. And that's why the market is also moving. So as the market is moving, the law also follows it, right? So the opportunity I see is in that need to consistently evolve, even as lawyers, right? We evolve with the market. Try to know what the new market trends are, try to know where the deals are happening, and how we can be able to tailor our skills to ensure that our interpretation of these laws, our advocacy on these laws meets, market realities.
Okay, Fola, will I be right? One word, that's what I said.
For
the future of the energy market.
I think...
Risky, promising, evolving, reforming.
Please, let me use two.
Okay, go ahead.
I think it is evolving and promising.
Thank you.
I think so.
Thank you very much. So on this note, our time is already up. Thank you very much. We have an evolving market, lots of opportunities. There are risks, but lots of opportunities. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I believe that our esteemed panelists, scene setter, and moderator deserve a better round of applause, distinguished guests. Thank you so much. All right. Please, can we have our photographers come forward for a brief photo opportunity?